Welcome everybody to this, the last Medieval Work in Progress seminar of our spring semester at the Courtyard. My name is Tom Exton, I teach Medieval Art and Architecture and convene this series. And just before introducing tonight's speaker, I just wanted to alert you to an event that we've got coming up next week, next Friday, which is our postgraduate medieval colloquium, Medieval Art on the Move. You can find that on the Courtyard website under the day of papers, a day of what looks to be very interesting papers, and I encourage you, if you've not already, to sign up for that. It should be a really good day and chance to hear about new research that's taking place here at the Courtyard and elsewhere. So that's Medieval Art on the Move on the Friday the 28th, which is next Friday, I think.
I think so.
Yes, I think so. But for now, it's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Mariam Rosser-Owen, so I'm playing around with these things too much, who is the curator responsible for the Arab World collections at the V&A here in London. Mariam specialises in, well, all sorts of things, but particularly the Islamic Mediterranean and especially al-Andalus and North Africa. She's published very widely on aspects of ivory production and ivory trade, which I think is kind of relates to this talk which she's going to give this evening. In 2021, she published Articulating the Hijaba, Cultural Patronage and Political Legitimacy in Al-Andalus, the ґɁàmirid Regency, which really an important study coming out of her PhD research, looking at the kind of art and architecture at the kind of end of the caliphal period in Al-Andalus, with a whole wonderful set of insights and ideas. That's available on open access as well, which is also very convenient. That's something I certainly give to my students a lot, as is her study Islamic Arts in Spain from 2010, which offers a really kind of wonderful synthesis of ideas on the Islamic arts of Spain, but with a kind of strong perspective using the V&A collections, thinking about the kind of historiography as well, but lots of very kind of lucid and original insights in there. Tonight she's going to talk about something that I think has kind of piqued her interest many, many years ago, but in a chance to really kind of expand on some thoughts that she gave at an event to celebrate Jeremy John's retirement last year. It is noteworthy that in this church there should be such an ancient tusk, elephant tusks in Spanish cathedrals. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Cool.
So as some of you know, and as Tom has just mentioned, my doctoral research and eventual book focused on the cultural and artistic patronage of the ₦àmirids, the dynasty who served as regents to the last Andalusi Umayyad Caliph Hisham II, who was only 11 when he came to the throne in 976. The most monumental and best surviving example of this patronage was the enormous extension to the Great Mosque of Córdoba, commissioned by the ʿＡmirid dynasty's founder al-Mansur in the 990s, and that's what you're seeing here. During my many hours of wandering around this building, studying its every aspect in detail, I noticed, hanging from a vault in the ʿAmirid extension, an elephant tusk. And here's a very bad photograph that I took myself in 2002, in the very early days of digital photography, so I blame the camera. And perhaps especially because of my interest in the ivory objects made in Al-Andalus in the 10th and 11th centuries, I've often wondered about this tusk and how it got to hang in the Mezquita-Catedral in Córdoba. And as Tom mentioned, the Feshrif conference, which was organised last year for my doctoral supervisor, Professor Jeremy Johns, gave me an incentive to finally look into it a bit more deeply and see if I could find out any more. So where is this tusk? It's hanging from a lucernario, or a lantern, an elevated dome flanked by windows, just inside the wall that separates the ʿāmirid extension of the 990s from the older part of the mosque, a few bays north of the Qibla wall. And if that doesn't make any sense, this is the plan of the mosque, this is the Qibla wall, this is the mihrab area over here. And this wall here, which you can also see here, was originally the external wall of the mosque that was extended, as it was extended by al-Hakam II in the 960s. And then this wall was pierced by al-Mansur, and this entire extension was added. So you can see through these enormous horseshoe arches from the ʿāmirid extension into the al-Hakam II period extension. And there are surviving some of the decoration of the original external gates, which you can see now in the interior of the mosque. And these blue arrows, because I don't have a very good photo sort of showing the tusk hanging in its context, these blue arrows here are pointing up into the lantern dome, which is also marked up here on the aerial view. So, as you know, the Córdoba Mosque has not been a static building since its first construction in the 8th century. Apart from the 3 important extensions during the Islamic period, after the Castilian conquest of Córdoba in 1236, the mosque was reconsecrated as a cathedral. Throughout the building are post-Islamic interventions on varying scales, ranging from lateral chapels to a simple altar leaning up against a wall. And most famously, the King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor Charles V was unhappy with the demolition that began in the 1520s to build a new cathedral across the ӓmirid extension, which you can see here in plan and here in the aerial view. So the wall that divides the ӓmirid extension from the rest of the mosque became known as the punto. And in the early 18th century, this part of the building was subject to a restoration programme, raising the roof, inserting these skylit lanterns, and whitewashing the mosque's polychromy to create a space of, quotes, beauty and clarity. And here I would like to acknowledge the work of Michelle Lamprocos on the post-Islamic life of the Great Mosque of Córdoba, and thank her for her help in answering my questions about this phase of the building and in sharing with me scans of the manuscript, which we're going to look at in a moment. The lantern from which the tusk is hanging dates to the 1710s. Thomas Fernandez Moreno was serving in the cathedral as a choir boy at the time of this extension and continued to serve in the cathedral as chaplain. In 1744, he wrote a description of the Mezquita-Catedral in his Relación de las Cosas Notables del Templo Material de la Santa Iglesia de Córdoba. It was intended to be an authoritative guide for the many foreigners who were increasingly visiting the city in the early decades of the 18th century, when intrepid travellers were first starting to discover Spain. And it survives in manuscript in the Real Academia de la Historia in Madrid. So we're going to look at this manuscript in some detail, and bear with me as this is the only primary information that seems to exist about the tusk. All later sources that I've been able to find refer back to this text, whether explicitly or implicitly. And I'd also like to thank my colleague Kirsten Kennedy for looking at my translation of the text with me and reassuring me that I was getting it right. So this is the first page of the manuscript, starting somewhere here. That in faith and testament of having put them in that place, that they should bring the old doors that were in Santiago in the door of the temple, and give them to this holy church as an eternal remembrance of this matter. The Moors brought them, and they were exhibited on the tirantes, the tie beams, because there were no vaults at that time, in the Nave del Punto in the year 1711, above the old memorial of the tusk. After the year 1713, when they turned the Nave del Punto into a vaulted space, which was the first part of the church to have that treatment, the aforesaid doors were obscured. Above the roof, techumbre, all the tie beams in the same place where they were, but they removed the nails for other repairs to the fabric of the building. So a few points of interest here. The mention of the bronze doors from the Cathedral at Santiago de Compostela, which al-Mansur was said to have brought with him as a trophy of his campaign there in 998. The Arabic sources of the time talk about these being installed on the mosque's roof, which has always seemed a very odd concept. The mention of techumbre here and tirantes, referring to the tie beams that brace a pitched wooden roof, might refer to wooden ceilings of the artisonado type that were installed in the mosque during later interventions. These kinds of ceilings always have an external roof over the top of them, and perhaps the Santiago doors served that function somehow. There's also an indication here of a connection between the doors and the tusk. So Fernández Moreno next describes the tusk, el colmillo. Since a little while ago I mentioned here the antiquity of the tusk of El Punto, it is noteworthy that in this church there should be such an ancient tusk. Since the triumphal carriage of King Al-Mansur, having been lost, and the nails from the doors of Santiago having been removed, it is significant that this instrument, this object, I think, was not made use of for other things. Despite this, it is now hanging, when before it was hanging from a tie beam in the same location, with a thick chain of iron in the vault above the punto that was first made in the year 1713. And having, since I was a child, wanted to know what this instrumento signified, a paper printed in verse came into my hands which dealt with it, and I am informed by ancient men of this holy church, it is said that King Abdullah al-Hakim or Ishem, whom the old Arabic stone in the Patio de Naranjos refers to, which I discuss above on folio 28, had an elephant. So another quick pause to pick out some significant things mentioned here. The triumphal carriage of al-Mansur, I have no idea what this means, and it's the first time I've ever come across anything relating to this in all the research I did on this man. Fernández Moreno mentions that the tusk was hanging from one of the vaults which were inserted in 1713, but before that date it was hanging from a wooden tie beam in the same location. Lastly, King Abdullah al-Hakim and Ishem refer to the three Andalusi Umayyad caliphs, Abdurrahman III, al-Hakam II, and Hisham II, and the old Arabic stone in the Patio de Naranjos refers to the mosque's foundation inscription on the mosque's facade and visible from the patio. Fernández Moreno also seems to express surprise that in all these years the tusk hadn't been made use of to carve something in ivory, especially when the nails from the Santiago doors had been repurposed. So one of the caliphs had an elephant, and having decided to expand and rebuild this temple, as is said on folio 24 on the authority of the Conde Lucanor, as stated in his book folio 3, he, the caliph, gave to the aforementioned elephant to help bring the materials, in particular marble, which was being cut in the quarries next to the ermitas, which are today in the mountains of Los Alcores and the Sierra de Córdoba, a very long way from there to the site, or the quarry called Verdadero de los Lobos, where can be seen big blocks of marble that were broken, thrown down into the deep ravine. And so tasked, this ferocious animal was made busy helping to carry hard rocks for this enterprise, and he became so worn out on the route that he burst, shedding his entrails. As a result of which, the regretful King Al-Hakim ordered that, in eternal memory of the animal, who had done so much to fulfill its obligations, giving its life in service of his great prophet, that a whole tusk should be removed and be placed as a trophy in the temple, as it still is today, this very great and singular decision of the caliphs. But it is folly what the public say about it, that this tusk is a bovine horn, because there has never been encountered an animal of that species with a horn this long. I have measured it when it was taken down in order to build the vault, and it is 7 palms in length, and it is of ivory, very white, a material which bovines do not possess. And it is massive and solid from the base to the tip, which horns are not, because they are hollow with an inner core which Mother Nature hides within them, which once removed, the outer shell is hollow. So according to Fernández Moreno, the tusk apparently came from an elephant owned by one of the three Andalusi Umayyad caliphs, who put it to work hauling marble blocks for the expansion of the mosque, most likely the expansion commissioned by Al-Hakam II in the 960s, because this is mentioned by the Conde Lucanor, a book of moralizing tales written in 1335 by Juan Manuel, a member of the Castilian royal households of Fernando IV and Alfonso XI, who served as military governor of Andalusia on behalf of the crown. And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole here. Initially, I was reading this as indicating that the whole story about the elephant's involvement in the mosque extension was included in one of the Conde's tales, which was potentially exciting because it would have indicated that the tusk was already hanging in the building in the 1330s. But having since checked the text and discussed it with my colleague Kirsten Kennedy, there's sadly no mention of an elephant in any of the tales, and it seems that Fernández Moreno is merely referring to the Conde Lucanor's authority for Al-Hakam's mosque extension, which is mentioned in his Ejemplo 41. And what we sadly have no idea about is the identity of this paper printed in verse, which apparently contains the story of the elephant. So if anyone here has any thoughts about what that could refer to, I would be extremely grateful to hear them. So this poor elephant became so worn out that it died in a rather dramatic fashion, and the caliph had one of its tusks removed and hung in the mosque to commemorate its divine service. Fernández Moreno's text tells us that the tusk was hung in its current position in 1713, but that it had already been hanging in that location from its high beam before the insertion of the lanterns and the rebuilding of this zone. He also gives us essential material information, because as he tells us, he measured it himself. He tells us it is 7 palms in length, which according to a much later native Cordoban historian, Miguel Salcedo, is equivalent to about 1.5 meters. And it's apparently solid all the way along. Back to my terrible photo. Indicating that the hollow top part of the tusk, which usually occupies about a third of an elephant tusk, seems to have been cut away. So we're sort of looking at a cut across here, and this part of the tusk, the solid dentine. So potentially the tusk was originally there, therefore close to 2 meters in length. The material is very white. Otherwise, Fernández Moreno remarks on no other distinguishing characteristics, indicating that it is an unworked tusk in its raw or natural state. And he talks about the chain from which it hangs being made of iron. From the ground, we can see that this chain is attached by 2 thick cuffs around the top of the tusk and towards the point. And the fact that Fernández Moreno himself measured it and wrote down his observations of the material shows an antiquarian interest in natural phenomena that was not unusual for the 18th century. The few others who've written about the tusk since the 18th century have dismissed the story of the caliph's elephant as, quotes, pure fantasy. Ramírez de las Casas Deza, in his mid-19th century Descripción de la Iglesia-Catedral de Córdoba, refers to the local belief that the tusk contains, quote, some particular mystery, since similar ones are found in various churches. But this seems to refer to the use of ivory oliphants to hold relics, and I want to make a clear distinction that what I'm talking about here are uncarved elephant tusks in their natural state, not the carved objects that seem to make use of this part of the tusk, and perhaps generated by the design not to waste any precious material in a region where there was extensive ivory carving. But that's another story which I'm not going to go into today. So Ramírez de las Casas Deza decides that the tusk, quotes, has no significance and was placed there merely because it was a very unusual object, having been found when the foundations were opened to construct the cathedral in the 1520s, implying an archaeological find of the tusk beneath the mosque. So he, like Fernández Moreno, assumes that the tusk had a centuries-long association with the building, going back to the time of the caliphs. Miguel Salcedo, writing much more recently in 2000, had little patience for past historians or public opinion. Quotes, "Apart from many other proofs to the contrary, we can argue that no Emir Abdurrahman existed when this little dome was constructed. What has without a doubt occurred is that the rich imagination of the Cordoban populace distorted and overwhelmed what they saw, and from the contemplation of such a characteristic piece of a pachyderm, wove a legend and awarded it to the Muslim period." He points out that the tusk was placed in this location in the Christian period and believes it to be a symbolic object because, quotes, "In the Middle Ages, elephants were symbols of temperance and wisdom, as well as eternity and pious beliefs." So it was due to symbolic virtues relating to Christianity that the tusk was installed in the lantern dome, but he offers no suggestion about where it might have come from. So in my correspondence last year with Alberto Estefes, the current archivist of Córdoba Cathedral, he has suggested the involvement of Bishop de Pathos y Figueroa, a significant figure in the church hierarchy in the late 16th century, who ended his career as Bishop of Córdoba, dying there in 1586. Pathos commissioned the decoration of the sacristy chapel, which you can see over on the right, and donated the sculpture of Christ crucified, not made from ivory, which hangs from the altar of San Sebastian, a knight's chest move away from the lantern where the tusk is hanging. Alberto observes that Pathos' numerous travels and contacts certainly would have given him access to pieces as luxurious as the ivory. As Bishop of Patti in Sicily for 10 years, he would have had access to trade goods from North Africa. Manuel Nieto, the previous archivist for many decades, had believed the tusk to have been an ex voto given by someone who had made his fame and fortune in the Americas or the Philippines. And the 16th century is a plausible moment for the arrival of the tusk in the cathedral, a period when Spain's global trade was intensifying via the circular Manila galleon route. According to Margarita Mercedes Este Marcos, around 40 to 50,000 tusks from African elephants arrived through this circular trade to the Philippines. So the Córdoba tusk is not the only one hanging in an ecclesiastical space in Spain. There's another elephant tusk hanging in the cloister of the cathedral in Seville, the part of the Almohad mosque, which survives most closely to its original appearance, though the tusk is overshadowed by the more famous crocodile that also hangs in the space, and after which this part of the building came to be named, the Nave del Lagarto, or Nave of the Lizard. So the nave already had this name by 1349, when a tomb was donated in this space, and the endowment deed specifies this as the location. More context comes from the Chronicle of Alfonso X, commissioned by his great-grandson Alfonso XI. In the year 1260, quotes, messengers came from Alban de Chaver, king of Egypt. Scholars have disagreed as to whether this sultan was Saifuddin Qutuz, who ruled for a year from 1259 to 60, or Baybars I, who came to power in 1260, but most recently Doris Behrens Abu Saif, in her study of Mamluk diplomacy, has described Baybars as the founder of Mamluk diplomacy and unequivocally attributes this gift to him. The chronicle continues. They brought presents to King Alfonso of many precious cloths of different kinds and of many rare and beautiful jewels. They also brought him an ivory, un marfil, and an animal called an atharafa, a giraffe, and an ass that was striped with one band white and the other black, indicating a zebra, and many other kinds of beasts and animals. The king welcomed warmly these messengers and did them great honour and sent them very well pleased from there. So this is all the original chronicle tells us, but historians have suggested that the Mamluks were seeking Alfonso's support against the Mongol threat. A more fanciful suggestion has also been made that the Mamluk Sultan was seeking the hand of Alfonso's oldest daughter, Berenguela, who was then aged only 7 years old. Both of these suggested contexts are intended to amplify the international extent of Alfonso's prestige as perceived by Spanish historians. Berens Abu Saif more realistically attributes the embassy to the promotion of trade, especially considering that Seville was a major exporter of olive oil in the Mediterranean. And the embassy might have been initiated by Alfonso, famously nicknamed El Sabio, the wise, for his sponsorship of learning, seeking to bring an astrologer, a famous astrologer, unnamed, from Egypt to Castile. This is suggested by the editors of the text. It's a closer view. So the 17th century history of Seville, written by Diego Ortiz de Zúñiga, gives us more information about the fate of the gifts. Regarding the exotic animals, these soon died because of the difference in climate, and Alfonso ordered that their skins be stuffed with straw and hung in the cloister of the Holy Church. Because the crocodile skin lasted the longest, the nave was given the name of lagarto. Ortiz de Zúñiga tells us that its skeleton was still there in his own day. However, the accounts of the fabric of the cathedral record a payment to a certain Juan Sanchez on July 3rd, 1465, for the painting of a crocodile, and the animal that is preserved in the cathedral today is a wooden sculpture. It appears to imitate a stuffed crocodile, and as Philippe Corday notes, it probably replaced a carcass that had crumbled to dust and that had held enough significance as to call for a replacement. Though the Alphonsine Chronicle's description of the embassy does not explicitly mention a crocodile, this was a distinctive animal known to be associated with the Nile, and if the account of the embassy from Egypt is true, there's every chance that the many other kinds of beasts and animals included a crocodile, though we might assume this to have been so unusual as to have merited a comment in the Chronicle in the same way as did the zebra. According to Berens Abu Saif, this gift from the Mamluks was not particularly unusual. Exotic animals, and especially elephants and giraffes, were among the most common gifts. She mentions a very similar gift package sent by Baybars to the Golden Horde in 1263, just a few years after the gift to Alfonso, which also included an elephant, a giraffe, zebras and monkeys. The Mamluks seem to have obtained their elephants from both Africa and India as gifts from other rulers. So here I'm going to go off into a little diversion about elephants. So we do know of quite a few examples of gifts of elephants to European monarchs. One of the earliest and most famous being Abul Abbas, the elephant sent from Harun al-Rashid to Charlemagne in the year 801, and which the Frankish king may have specifically requested from the Abbasid caliph. There are several examples in the 13th century, including another elephant sent by a sultan of Egypt, in this case the ʿＡmirid al-Kamil, to the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II in 1229. Known as the Cremona elephant, it was used by Frederick in his triumphal parades and mentioned in the Annals of Cremona in 1237. Another elephant was given by Louis IX of France to Henry III of England in 1255 for his menagerie at the Tower of London. It was drawn from life by Matthew Paris for his Chronica Majora. And sadly, this elephant is said to have died in 1257 from drinking too much wine. We also have some famous examples from the 16th century, including two elephants given as gifts by kings of Portugal. Hanno, an Indian elephant, who was given by Manuel I to Pope Leo X in 1514, but who died only 2 years later, and whose tusks are still preserved today in the Sala dell'Archivio Capitolare in the Vatican. And the elephant named Solomon, or Sulaiman, in deliberate evocation of the Ottoman Sultan Sulaiman the Magnificent, which was sent by João III to the then Archduke and later Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II in 1551 as a wedding present. So this elephant's journey from Lisbon to Vienna was beautifully novelised by the Portuguese writer José Saramago. Again, Sulaiman only lived for a short while in his new home, and I believe that one of his feet was turned into a stool for the emperor. So returning to Alfonso's gift, Intriguingly, Berens Abu Saif says that no ivory is mentioned among the diplomatic gifts offered by the Mamluks, but the Alphonsine Chronicle appears to include mention of an ivory tusk among the gifts. The Spanish word in the text is un marfil, which is the word used to describe the material of ivory, its etymology deriving from the Arabic minaba fil, from the tooth of an elephant, indicating a tusk. The English translators of the Chronicle have rendered marfil as elephant, perhaps understandably, as it is mentioned in the context of other exotic beasts. So perhaps it is more likely that Baber sent an elephant to Alfonso in 1260, but since the text says ivory and not elephant, I prefer to consider that it was a tusk rather than an animal. Though again, if anyone has come across the use of marfil to indicate an elephant, I would be grateful to know. And if the crocodile hanging in the cathedral was associated with this embassy, then it would seem likely that the tusk was too. Like the tusk in Córdoba, it is suspended from thick chains attached to thick metal cups. Another avenue I haven't yet taken, which probably requires getting up on some scaffolding, is to look more closely at the chains to see if it's possible to put a date on them in terms of any technical characteristics. Also, like the tusk in Córdoba, it appears to have been chopped off or broken at its wider end, as well as at the pointed end. So at a guess, again based on the Córdoba tusk, this could measure about 2 meters in length. So it's suggestive of the type of elephant ivory that the early Mamluks had access to. The third and final tusk, hanging in a Spanish ecclesiastical space, is this one in Toledo Cathedral, which I have to confess I did not know about when I started the research on this paper, and many thanks to Therese Martin and Francisco Hernandez for bringing this to my attention. It hangs on a pier, close to the entrance to the cathedral from the patio del reloj. I've indicated, as far as I can reconstruct, its location by this little blue circle. But I assume it's been moved over the years, not least when these lights for the cathedral's Soleil Lumière shows were installed. Again, it hangs from metalwork that doesn't easily allow us to suggest chronology. The simple cuffs at either end appear to be gilded, and the chains seem similar to those at Seville, but also not quite the same. The tusk itself seems huge from the ground, and a close-up image, which we'll see in a moment, shows that both ends seem to be quite damaged. So I haven't yet been able to uncover anything apart from local myths and legends about this tusk. Scholars who work on the cathedral's inventories have come across no mention of an elephant tusk, colmillo, through the inventories, though the inventories from 1257 and 1277 both mention un cuerno de marfil. In the later inventory, this is associated with Alfonso VII of Leon Castile, who ruled from 1126 to 1157. And I'd also like to thank Tom for discussing this with me pretty much exactly a year ago when I started looking into this. I think cuerno, or horn, is more likely to refer to an oliphant. For example, it's the word used by the antiquarian José Villarreal y Castro to describe the oliphant that is still in the cathedral at Zaragoza. It seems that colmillo tends to be used for an elephant tusk in its raw state. And as a postscript, there is no oliphant in the Toledo collection today. The Leyendas de Toledo website, from which this photo comes, says that local legend associates the tusk with one of the oxen that transported the first stones to raise the church, and which died as a result of the effort it expended, a clear echo of the story told about the Córdoba tusk. Another blog repeats this story but adds a new possibility. There are those who relate this cuerno, quote, there are those who relate this cuerno with the Mozarabs. Since the Muslims prohibited the use of bells to call Christians to prayer, the Mozarabs used this kind of horn as an alert that the homily was starting. An Instagram post from January 2024 And my apologies, because whenever I look at Instagram on my laptop, for some reason it defaults the language to Korean. Anyway, so this is Sarah Rosser in January 2024, posting about the colmillo de elefante. And this elicited quite a few comments. Margarita 9605, which is this is the end of the comment that you can see at the top of the screen, commented that it's the tusk of an elephant that participated in the construction of the cathedral. I am from Toledo, and this is what has always been said about it. And then Barona Sanchez Fernando reminded readers that in the Polígono de Toledo, the industrial zone to the east of the city, were found the remains of a mammoth, which are now in the Museo de Santa Cruz in Toledo, but not on public display. So this is referring to the cranium and 2 intact tusks of an elephant found in Toledo in 1972 during construction in this new zone. But these were not from a mammoth, but from the extinct Elephas or Paleoloxodon antiquus, known as the straight-tusked elephant, which inhabited Europe, and especially the warmer climes of southern Europe during the late Pleistocene, between 300,000 and 400,000 years ago. They've been found archaeologically in central Spain and Portugal, and a particularly significant find of 50 individual elephants and many tusks has been excavated at Ambrona in the province of Soria. Paleoloxodon antiquus was one of the largest elephants that ever lived, and their tusks could reach 3.5 to 4 meters in length. So could another tusk have been uncovered at Toledo in some earlier historical period and hung in the cathedral as a wondrous object? These tusks seem to me very different in shape and appearance, and though the Toledo tusk does look rather desiccated, it doesn't appear to be archaeological in the same way as the tusks found with the cranium or those excavated at Ambrona. That's obviously very subjective. So can the physical characteristics of the tusks tell us anything about the elephants they came from? This is difficult without being able to get closer to them. And obviously I'm now plotting how I might be able to do that, and ideally also analyse them. I've shown these photos to my colleague Ashley Kutu at the Pitt Rivers Museum, who specialises in the study of historic ivory by archaeological science. She thinks that the tusks in Seville and Toledo could be from African savanna elephants, while the Córdoba tusk could potentially be from a forest elephant. These are more slender and a bit straighter than those of savanna elephants. But it's obviously difficult to make such assessments on visual analysis alone and from a distance. The Córdoba tusk measures 1.5 meters in length and may originally have measured 2 meters. The Seville tusk perhaps measured the same. The Toledo tusk looks particularly huge. This suggests they all came from African elephants, those whose tusks are typically bigger in length and circumference than those of Asian elephants. Compare the size of these poached tusks being carried to a pyre in Nairobi in 2016 for destruction by cremation. Tusks of African bull elephants can grow to more than 3 meters in length and can weigh up to 90 kilos. Below is a famous photo taken around 1895 in the National Archives in Zanzibar, showing 4 men supporting the weight of a particularly huge tusk. Are there other examples of elephant tusks hanging in other churches and cathedrals? I've not come across any, apart from one significant example which I'll come to shortly, but I've not done an exhaustive survey, and also would be very grateful to hear of any others that anyone here might know about. However, we do have the suggestion of ivory tusks on the move in both textual and visual sources, and I'll focus on the Iberian context. We have a tantalising documentary source from a very early period, and I would like to thank Silvia Armando for bringing this source to my attention. This is the generous donation made by Bishop Rosendo to the monastery he founded at Celanova in Galicia, not far from Orense, in 935, and you've got this on the screen. So this included 2 silver crosses, one adorned with gems, candelabra, chalices, one of which with its paten was strangely made of ivory, almafil, and most significantly a dente elefantino, an elephant's tooth. Estella Marcos speculates that this tusk might, 250 years later, have been used to make the ivory crook of a bishop's staff, which is associated with the canonization of Rosendo in 1194, but the style and technique of this crook associates it with a type of ivory made in Sicily in the 12th century. It's highly significant, though, that a dente elefantino, an ivory tusk, should have been circulating in the north of the peninsula in 935. This is extremely early. We know that ivory carving was already underway in Córdoba by the 930s because Ibn Hayyan, our main historical source on the Andalusi caliphal period, records the contents of a luxurious gift sent by Abdurrahman III to his main North African ally, Musa ibn Abil Afia, in 934. The gift included several ivory and silver caskets, all apparently containers for luxury perfumes and other items for personal adornment. The Arabic word aj is used for the ivory material. The tusks that were entering Córdoba at this time to make these luxury objects for caliphs and to be given by caliphs probably came by precisely these relations with the North African tribes who were governing the Western Maghreb in the Umayyads' name and who enabled them to access the riches of the trans-Saharan trading network. Could one of these tusks have been bought by or given to Bishop Rosendo, along with, perhaps, the chalice and paten, which are oddly also described as having been made from ivory? So the monastery of San Salvador in Celanova became the wealthy abbey of the Benedictines, but I need to look further into its significance in the 10th century and its possible ties to Córdoba. Another kind of document, a visual one this time, shows an ivory tusk being transported by a figure on horseback, while three other figures, seemingly monks, help to take the weight. This mode of transport reminds me of the porters carrying the Zanzibar tusk some 800 years later. This ivory plaque, which was unfortunately destroyed in the Second World War, shows the arrival of the tusk from which the panels of the reliquary casket of San Millán de la Corolla were going to be made. And here's a picture of the casket today, sadly totally despoiled of all its ivory plaques during the Napoleonic occupation of Spain. And so the ivory plaques which survived that are dispersed now around different international museum collections. And Maeve O'Donnell Morales is working on a new reconstruction of the casket and how the plaques would have related to each other. The casket likely dates to between 1060 and 1080, coinciding with the second translation of San Millán's relics. This is around the time when ivory starts to be made in Iberia's northern realms, with Leon becoming a particular centre for this. It's also the time when the Taifa rulers of Toledo, the Banu Dhunnun, were sponsoring ivory production. It's a well-tested, but I think safe assumption that the raw material for both these ivory-producing centres came from Córdoba, probably from caliphal stockpiles of tusks that were looted and dispersed during the years of the fitna, the civil war in the early 11th century. So looking beyond Iberia, there's a particularly spectacular example in the Vatican, and I'd like to thank Sarah Guerin for sharing this photo with me. Known as the Tusk of Constantine, it now hangs in the Sala dell'Archivio Capitolare in the treasury of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It's been at the Vatican since at least the 1520s, when it was depicted in a painting in the Hall of Constantine, one of the rooms designed and painted by Raphael and his students. In the background to a scene that represents the donation by the Emperor Constantine of authority over Rome and the western parts of the Roman Empire to the Pope, the tusk is seen suspended between two of the columns in front of the tomb of St. Peter. Margherita Guarducci, who studied this tusk and its possible meaning in Raphael's painting, suggests that it had been a gift to a pope or a votive offering to St. Peter, and she assumes its antiquity, suggesting that it came to Rome in the early medieval period, though there's no evidence for this. So Guarducci tells us that its total length is 2.45 metres, and as we can see at the left of the photograph, this includes the hollow proximal end that would have sat within the elephant's jaw in its lifetime, the part that the tusks in Córdoba and Seville seem to be missing. The tusk of Constantine thus gives a good idea of the original size of the Iberian tusks that we can't appreciate by looking up from the ground. The Vatican tusk has a maximum diameter of 15 centimetres and can, by its dimensions, be identified as coming from an African elephant. Its rings and suspension chains are made of iron and appear to have been made in the second half of the 18th century, probably when the tusk was moved to its current location in the Chapter House, which was completed at that time. Other instances of this phenomenon that I've found seem to refer to oliphants rather than elephant tusks. For example, Ernst Kuhnel's documentary appendix to his monumental 1971 Die Islamische Elfenbeinskulpturen includes the cornu eboneo pendente subtrabe ultra magnum altare, an ivory horn hanging from a beam above the main altar of Canterbury Cathedral. The anonymous author of The Rites of Durham describes the shrine of St. Cuthbert as it was in the first half of the 16th century. Quotes, "If it were gold, silver or jewels, it was straightway hung on the shrine, and if it were any other thing, as a unicorn's horn, elephant's tooth or such like, it was hung within the feretory at the end of the shrine." Again, probably the elephant's tooth mentioned here is an oliphant. Kuhnel's appendix mentions a cornu eboneum that is said to have belonged to St. Oswald, but which has been missing since the Reformation. This same Durham inventory of 1383 also mentions 2 griffin's claws and several griffins, really ostrich eggs, and one of these claws is probably the large alpine ibex horn today in the British Museum, which features late 16th or early 17th century silver mounts inscribed "The claw of a griffin sacred to the blessed Cuthbert of Durham." There are many other examples of griffin's claws found in European churches. The unicorn's horn mentioned in the Rites of Durham was another wondrous natural object that was frequently found in churches. Actually, the tusk of a narwhal, a small whale that lives in the Arctic Ocean, and in the medieval period travelled further south than it does today. And I've already mentioned ostrich eggs, which were thought to be griffin eggs. Philippe Corday, who has written about this phenomenon of dedicating and displaying naturalia to ecclesiastical contexts, also discusses coconuts turned into chalices, spectacular nautilus shells and monstrous animals whose taming and conquest could symbolise the triumph of Christianity over evil, often represented sculpturally as a dragon. So crocodiles came into this category, and surprisingly, the crocodile in Seville is not the only one. 23 large reptiles have been identified in the churches of Spain and Portugal, though most of them date from after 1600 and are caimans from the Americas. And I'm illustrating this point with 2 other hanging crocodiles which colleagues have told me about during the course of this research, both without dates or contexts beyond local legends. So extraordinary natural phenomena were dedicated to churches as trophies or ex votos because of their allegorical symbolism or magical properties. For example, the narwhal's tusk was thought to counter the effects of poison, or simply because their large size or rarity incited wonder. Corday argues that eventually these collections contributed to the development of a scholarly interest in the natural world alongside cabinets of curiosities. Corday does not, however, discuss elephant tusks, surprisingly perhaps, given his other publications include work on oliphants and ivory chess pieces. So returning to our 3 tusks in Spanish cathedrals, why are they hanging there? Was it because their monumental size and their association with an exotic beast made them wondrous objects in their own right? Is where they are hanging significant?
For Seville, it would seem so. As Rafael Ramos points out, the Nave del Lagarto, which you can see highlighted in this blue circle, was a place of passage from the cathedral's Puerta del Perdón, which is here, towards the interior of the church. So this location was significant. The presence of the ivory tusk and the crocodile, hanging at the point at which the courtyard of the Almohad mosque intersects with the cathedral, perpetuated the memory of a splendid embassy with exotic gifts, and by extension Alfonso X's prestige among the Muslim rulers of the East. But it also made a connection to the memory of Muslim rule in al-Andalus. In Alfonso's day, the great Almohad mosque was still very much intact. For Toledo, we don't yet have enough information. For Córdoba, the tusk may have been associated with the 16th century bishop, or with Spanish trade in the Americas, or it might have already been hanging in the ʿＡmirid mosque extension, associated in some way with al-Mansur's triumphal carriage and the doors from Santiago Cathedral. I like to think that these tusks could be the remains of raw materials that supplied these two great centres of Andalusi ivory carving, Córdoba and Toledo. Could they actually have been hanging there since the 10th and 11th centuries, moved around over the years as the buildings were expanded and changed? And might we find another tusk in Leon? Thank you.